Well, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully, you're all having a wonderful Sunday in this wonderful time of August. Again, I apologize if you're hearing some background noise, but currently I have my AC on because we are experiencing some relatively high humidity and some not so great heat. So it's hot outside, and I want my home to be cold, very, very cold. So today we are going to be talking about a very important topic for those of you who at some point hope to publish maybe some Python projects that you're working on. So we're going to be talking about how to package and publish a Python project that you have and you want to share with the rest of the Python community. Now, just some background to this topic. The reason I actually chose it was initially when I went through this project with my own first package, I realized that it's actually kind of confusing, especially when you're new to it. And luckily, I've now had the opportunity to do this a few times. So I've picked up a couple tricks here and there, and I've encountered enough errors and gotten over those errors to, I at least hope, be able to talk somewhat intelligently about the topic and hopefully shed some light on things that you need to consider when you're thinking about building your own project and things to keep an eye out for. Now, this is actually going to break out over a few videos just because it's a relatively, deep topic and there's a lot of different things we have to talk about. I will tell you right now, there's not going to be pretty much any coding for the most part. It's really more talking about just how do you structure your project? How do you go through the process of defining the necessary files required to package and publish your projects? And what are some of the services that you're going to need to work with in order to make sure that people can find your projects? So, very important topic. And I hope, again, I think most importantly is to shed some light for those of you who might be new to the topic and aren't necessarily sure where to start, like I was. Don't worry, you're not alone in the process. All right, so the first thing that we're going to talk about is how to structure your project. Now, the nice thing about this topic is it's not clear cut. And you might be saying, Alex, why is that a good thing? Well, it's a good thing because it does give you some degree of flexibility. There's not necessarily one way to approach how to structure your project. You're just going to find that some approaches work better for certain situations. So I actually have a repo on my GitHub page that you are more than welcome to use as a basis for how to follow a structure. Now, I'm not going to say it's perfect in every regard, but I find, at least for me, it works relatively good. I will tell you some things not to do, and I will tell you some things that, well, you can kind of do it, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. And then I'm going to tell you things that you should highly encourage yourself to do. So if you go on my repo page, aread1192, you will see a bunch of different stuff. And if you go into my repositories tab, you will see a bunch of different repositories. But the one you care about is the Sigma-coding one. Now, the first thing I do want to put out there for those of you who are considering having your own project and publishing it, while it is not required that it be on GitHub in order to publish it, I would highly, highly, highly recommend that you put it there, even if it's a private repository. The only reason I say that is A, if something happens to your system, guess what? You're not SOL and you lost all your work, right? The other benefit is if you do plan to make your project more public and more, out there for other people to use, most people are going to be using GitHub anyway. So just save yourself the headache, put it there, because I guarantee if you don't put it there, people are going to ask you to put it there. So the first thing I would tell anyone who's thinking about having a Python project, just upload it to GitHub. Make it where other people can find that information. And if you want to put additional information out there, I would say put it there before you put it in the actual package yourself, because a lot of times people aren't going to actually look in the package. I think I'll tell you why when we get there, but most of the time people go to GitHub for resources related to different types of Python packages. So, and there's also some advantages when it comes to indexing it on PyPI. Now, beyond that, the first thing I'm going to get into is how do we think about structuring our project? Well, the first thing I'm going to ask you is, well, how complex is your project? The only reason I say that, or I ask that, is that's really going to start defining how do you think about the structure of it? So say, for example, we use one of my first repos that I published, the TD Ameritrade Python API library. I think I have that one open. Do I have it open? I don't think I have it open, but we can open. There it is. With this particular project, it's all related around using the TD Ameritrade API. And so if you were to go on to GitHub right now, you will see all these different folders here, or at least most of them, and you will see the main folder called TD. And inside this particular folder, you will see all the different Python modules that exist in this particular package. So if you really want to think about it, your TD folder is your package, and that package contains multiple modules. And all those modules basically fall under that package. They're all related to that package. So if you go into my TD project, you will see there's the client one, that's for the main TD client. There's a streaming client. There's stuff related to options change, authentication, orders. But the idea behind it is you have this high-level hierarchy, which is defined as your package, and that package contains multiple modules. Now, that's for basically a single project. What you will sometimes see people do is they will package multiple packages together in something called a namespace. So you'll see this a lot of times with big companies like Microsoft or Google, right? To give you an example, Microsoft has the Azure platform, and then Google has the Google Cloud platform. They have Google Maps, right? And then what you might find within Google Maps is there's different products and services, right? So Google Maps has Google Places, it's got Google Snap to Roads, Google, I don't know, Directions, something like that. So you have different products and services that fall under the bigger umbrella of Google Maps. Same thing with Azure. You've got the Microsoft Azure platform, but that platform has different services. It's got SQL databases, it's got quantum computing, it's got API management, it's got web apps, it's got lots of different services. So in that situation, it might make more sense to do something called a namespace. Now, with this particular topic, I like just showing it because I think it says 10 times more than explaining it. So with a packaging namespace, you're going to have multiple packages, and those packages are loosely related. At least that's how the documentation puts it. And the idea behind that is, well, how are they all loosely related? Well, for example, Microsoft Azure, the Azure SQL management database is loosely related to the Azure, web app service. How are they loosely related? Well, they all fall under the Azure platform. So in that situation, it might make more sense to do a namespace structure. What does that mean? Well, it means normally if the user installs it, they're going to install like 90 different packages. Now, I'm just exaggerating it, but generally speaking, they're going to install more packages. That's good and bad. But then at the same time, it does give you a nice little bit of advantage. The nice advantage is if you want to still keep your packages separate, you are allowed to do that. That is also very important because what it allows you to do is have them still fall under the same umbrella, but they're really still separate. So that's advantageous where if I want to keep my TD one separate and push updates to that one, I don't have to always upload necessarily all the other ones, right? So they're related, but they're not necessarily absolutely dependent on each other. So that's really advantageous for those of you who might have multiple projects or packages that you want to upload under the same namespace. Now, in our particular example, I'm going to do this. The only reason I'm doing this is I think it's the more complex example, but also at the same time, I have multiple projects. How are they all loosely related? Well, they're all created by Sigma coding, right? So I'm going to say, well, they're all loosely related because they fall under Sigma coding. And what we'll find is really the idea is the same. It's just you got to make some minor modifications to the files that specify the packaging and uploading of it. So other than that, that's one of the bigger considerations you're going to have to start thinking through when how you're going to approach your project. Because I will tell you this, if you know beforehand that it's all a namespace, it's better to structure it as a namespace out of the gate than doing what I had to do, which is, well, last minute, I want to make it a namespace. So now I have to figure out ways to structure it. And basically it required automating, like pulling in multiple different folders. So I will say you really want to kind of think through your project a little bit before, instead of just rushing into it and then deciding 5 minutes later, well, actually it should have been a namespace, but now I've done like all this time coding it as if it was just a single package. So don't rush that process, really think it through. Additionally, normally with different projects and stuff like that, it's not uncommon to have a samples folder. The samples folder is really just how do you use the code, like what are some examples and stuff like that. You'll also see a testing folder. So this is great for those of you who want to run your own unit test, or if you want to make modifications to the project. You're not having to sit there rushing, going, oh, what do I do? How do I fix it? It makes it easier for other individuals to either contribute to the project, or if they want, they can take this project on their own, and they have a testing framework now where they can start making modifications to it, and then they can test to see what happens after they make those modifications. So I will encourage you want to make sure you do have unit testing. This is sometimes what's skipped over. I will admit in the first part of it, I was pretty horrible at this. I've definitely gotten better at it. Doesn't mean it's perfect, but you want to try to test as much as you can, and you want to make sure you're keeping an eye out for certain things. And as you're making changes, you want to make sure that you test it before you necessarily upload it. Now, you also have to keep in mind as well, you're going to have users who are on different platforms, different versions of Python and stuff like that. That's just the reality of the beast. There's going to be situations where it's like, well, it worked for you, but it didn't work for him. And well, he's on Mac, he's on Windows. Well, that one's on Linux, but that one's on a different version of Linux. And then everyone's going to get lost. You just kind of have to take it one issue at a time, and you're going to have to determine, where do you put your priority? You got to say, if you're a one-man show like I am, you got to distribute your time equally across different libraries. So, you have to hit where you're going to necessarily make the biggest bang for your buck, right? If I can, pound out an issue that affects 30 different people at once, I'm probably going to prioritize that one, right? So you want to make sure you have a testing framework. You really want to make sure that you have a samples file there as well. You want to make sure you don't have any sensitive information in here. So for example, usually on my own personal desktop or system, I will have a configuration file, but I will make sure not to upload your configuration file. You really want to make sure you take these sensitive information, things like your API keys, things like your access tokens, keep those separate. Doesn't mean it's not going to happen every once in a while. Trust me. I'm the first one to admit it. It happened to me. I learned my lesson, but learn from my mistake. Please make sure you cleanse your repo before you do it. Probably a better thing to do is you have environment variables all set up. I don't know. I'm just old-fashioned. I don't know if that's even old-fashioned, but I'm just stuck in my ways. But so that's one, is you want to make sure you don't have any sensitive files in here. And then you want to have your main folder, right? So your main one in this example is, at least in mine, is Sigma, right? So because I'm doing a namespace, my outer namespace folder is my Sigma one. And then inside there, you're going to see my each individual repository that I've had. Well, not repository, you really don't want to start mixing GitHub repositories together, but you see each different package. So I have one for my Congress one, my Federal Register one, the Bureau of Economic Analysis one, and all the files and modules that go along with that one. Now, here's a topic where I've gotten different answers depending on which forum I'm looking at and depending on how old it is. Supposedly, I have been told that you do not need to technically include anymore the init.py file. However, I've run into issues where if I don't include it, then the setup.py file, which we'll explain in a little bit, doesn't actually know which files to include. So I can't say with 100% confidence that you don't technically need it, because I've read that you don't need it. But then if I didn't include it, people said, well, include it anyway, because that's probably what was causing the issue. So I think part of it also has to do with the version of Python that you're on. So if you're on much older versions, you are required to have the init.py file. However, if you're on newer ones, You shouldn't need to, but it's also, you have to determine what the project is at hand. Sometimes you're going to be leveraging that file, and if that is the case, then you need to include it. So that's why when you go into my namespace, you will see most of them don't have it, but then some do. So some I was able to get away with it, some I wasn't. Probably at some point, I'm just going to clean it up and just get rid of it, because at this point, I think I'm going to say you don't need it, but if you run into issues where it comes to finding or uploading it, I would just encourage you, try putting in a init.py file in there and see what happens. You probably should be okay. The other big thing is it's also going to depend once you do an installation or not. Once you usually install, it's a different story, but that's just some stuff to keep in mind. How long have we been going on? We'll go on a little bit longer, but I'm probably going to wait for the setup.py file next. But yeah, so that's one thing. And then the other things too, and again, I'm not going to say I'm perfect at it, obviously, but you really want to try to document your code. This can be left over sometimes, and people sometimes don't leave this out. Ideally, you want to document it. You really should strive to use type hinting, because it does make things easier, and it does enhance certain functionality in different IDEs like Visual Studio Code and stuff like that. So I will say you really want to focus on it, because sometimes this is skipped over, and when it's skipped over, it really does make the library hard to use. I will say probably the best one I've ever done for documentation purposes was either the PyRobot one. I think on that one, I pretty much documented every little thing. And then the Python SEC one. And I will say, you want to have examples in there as well. I've already talked about this, I think, in a previous video when it comes to leveraging certain functionality in Visual Studio Code when it comes to doc strings. So it actually does have, like, I don't know if it's officially called Markdown or whatever, but if you basically follow certain formatting principles, you can actually have special, like, I guess format. I don't know. Maybe it's formatting. I don't know anymore. But it displays the doc string a little bit differently. So, for example, whenever you put, like, I think it's a minimum of 2 you have to put, and when you put 2 under here, it will make it where it makes it basically like all upper. It makes it like a header font basically. So that's important. And then additionally, if you indent your code and then you do it with your little preceding 3 arrows, then it gives us syntax highlighting for code basically. So if you look here, it's like, oh, okay, so it's going to give us, like, syntax highlighting and stuff like that. So that's also really advantageous just for readability purposes, and where if somebody does want to leverage the doc strings, it's a little bit easier to read and things like that. So examples do help. Again, I'll be the first one to admit it. It's a very tedious process, especially when you were like me initially and you wrote all your doc strings a certain way thinking that there was no special formatting in Visual Studio Code, and then you realize there was, and then you have to go back and change every one of them. So yeah, I can totally empathize with anybody who feels that way. But, I will say there's definitely some advantages to it. And you really, again, you want to try to comment your code. I over comment. I'll be the first one to admit it, but 90% of the times these are for tutorials. So I lean on the side of over commenting, because I just assume that nobody knows anything about it when they're starting to go into it. So drawback is it takes more time. Benefit is I think there's a little bit more clarity when you're using it. So those are just some things I would tell you to consider when you're doing it. Additionally, you want to have a README file, and we'll talk a little about this in the next video, and then we'll talk about some of these more specific files and kind of how they fall into the bigger picture. So at this point, I'm going to cut off the video because I think I've talked long enough. And then in our next video, we're going to talk about the setup.py file and how that relates to our packaging process. We will briefly talk about kind of the different types of projects. I know I kind of was making a statement here saying, well, namespaces and all this and that, but there's also another way that you can start thinking about projects and really who the intended audience is for, and how that might impact the way you start structuring some of them. So At this point, if you have any questions more on just like high level, how should I structure my project, or maybe what's the advantage of doing this versus this, or from your experience, what did you find? And I might or might not have an answer, but ask away and I'll try to chime in if I can. Otherwise, we will see you in video number 2.